All right, everybody. Welcome to my session on IPMX for live production. Actually, this is kind of a rebuttal to the other, because everybody always talks about how IPMX is like great for Pro AV. It's got HDCP support. But I would like to make the case during this 20-minute talk that IPMX is actually really awesome for live production, but for kind of a non-technical reason that you might already guess, but I like to highlight the point anyway. So as we all know, that there are tons of places where live production happens that have really nothing to do with making any money, right? So I always like to think of like, when we think of broadcast, we think of like the people doing live productions so that they can make money. The content is the point, but there's a vast, amount of content happening out there. Well, actually, for making money, the creator space is part of that too. But then also you've got, houses of worship, corporate environments, schools are doing tons of live production. I asked a large multinational organization, how many, Ross Vision switchers do you have in your facility? And they said hundreds. So, I mean, worldwide, they have hundreds of them. So there's a lot of live production happening outside of broadcast. So what I want to look at though is kind of the case of like, take a small system, right? So let's take like a very common system that you would see in like a Pro AV live production environment. So you're in the back of a church or you're doing lecture capture, you've got 3 cameras, maybe you've got an audio mixer in there, you're bringing that feed in and you just want to do some switching, right? So I want to look at, in my talk, the bulk of my talk is going to really be about kind of 3 scenarios, right? We're going to take a look at SMPTE 2110, we're going to look at NDI, and we're going to take a look at IPMX and compare the 3 of them. So of course, as Jed mentioned earlier in the prior talk, that SMPTE 2110 is the right solution for live production, right? Sometimes, right? So when it's exactly right, it's when you're round tripping SDI. Actually, one of my friends said, they made SDI, or they made it SMPTE 2110 so that they can make really cheap gateways, which I thought was funny. But the idea is that with SMPTE 2110 and -40 especially, the audio and the video signals that are packed into those flows can go right in and out of SDI without really very much translation at all. So you get sub-millisecond precision, you get the same kind of timing performance that you would get in an SDI system. And so it's really, how do we get what we've gotten with the SDI world, but now with network switches? And that's really the question that SMPTE 2110 was meant to answer. But the challenge with SMPTE 2110 is that, that uncompressed video flows, the PTP setup, that can be a lot for someone to handle, right? Even a single switch installation, even if you know how to turn this network switch on, you know how to plug the cables in, you've been successful in the past with other systems out there, but you can find yourself in a situation with SMPTE 2110 where it's not working and you don't really know why, and then you get frustrated. It's that accessibility thing. It's like the most important thing in software and hardware. We all make products, right? The amount of pain the customer has to go through to get from where they are to the solution is kind of the determining factor of your success. And in a broader world of live production, SMPTE 2110 can be a little bit of a challenge. But if we were going to build our small system, we could do it. Our switch is going to be a little bit more expensive. We might be, if we're doing a 1080p production, we might be able to get away with a 10 gig switch. Maybe a 25 gig switch would be a little more comfortable. We want a PTP Grandmaster. Now, technically, I'm being a little bit mean to SMPTE 2110 here because we can get away with cutting a lot of corners here. We don't really need the PTP accuracy that you would have in a very large production, but just because it's my talk and not your talk, I'm going to do it this way. You guys can do your own and do it your way. I'm just kidding. But just kind of sticking with the canonical 2110 path here. We'll assume we're going to use an inexpensive Grandmaster, a Arista Cisco switch for, small switch to make it work. We'll stand up an NMOS registry. And we're going to use the registry because a lot of SMPTE 2110 style NMOS systems out there really don't support the ad hoc mode that NMOS does support. So in NMOS, you can run it with a registry or actually without. So like the same mechanism that helps you find your printer, you can use an NMOS system without having to actually have a registry on the system. However, in a SMPTE 2110 system, that typically doesn't happen. You also need an I/O card. We're talking about uncompressed here. usually you need an IPO card. There are, you know, systems out there where you can do it with a very, very good NIC card, or even a NIC card that's, you know, accelerated with extra software on board. But typically you'll find an IO card that helps you accelerate that. That's just mainly to help you get to line rate with uncompressed video over an IP network. So when you get to 4K, which is not very common in broadcast, but ironically, it's actually quite a bit more common in the live production space where we're not planning to put it over the air. So you'll actually see quite a bit of 4K production out there. The price jumps, right? Because if you're talking about uncompressed video, you're definitely into a 25 gig switch, maybe even a 100 gig switch. So it just kind of jumps up there, especially in the switch category. One thing I will mention, I've been beating up on SMPTE 2110 here. One of the things that's really nice is that it's interoperability with AES-67, right? So audio synchronization, iMag, live situations, those are dialed in. You know, that's kind of why you went the SMPTE 2110 route. Now we're going to talk about NDI. So that's we're jumping on the other end of the scale now. Now, NDI is really the technology, I would argue, that really brought us video over IP in the live production space. So SMPTE 2110 and NDI kind of were born around the same time, but it was really NDI that made it accessible, right? So, you know, vMix, very popular, full bandwidth NDI, we can get, you know, down to maybe 100 megabits per second, but usually higher than that for decent quality. Of course, HX3, that's awesome. That gives you access to a whole huge ecosystem of cameras, 28 megabits per second, easily on a 1 gig connection. vMix and OBS, kind of very popular live stream applications. So for what we're talking about here, that's a great setup. Now, but let's take a very common situation, and this is, you know, part of what kind of I set up in the beginning here. With NDI, now there's NDI and then there's NDI in real life, right? So like NDI has, like the newest NDI has NDI Genlock, things like that. But when you're actually using the system in real life, typically speaking, there is no clock involved. I mean, like there's a media clock from the source that comes in, your device is going to get that content in, and it's going to, you know, basically align it up, right? And if you have to realign your sources, let's say one of your cameras is NDI full bandwidth, speed HQ, and maybe your other two cameras are HX3, right? Your latency between those cameras is going to be quite different. So if you're using NDI in any kind of situation that supports it, you're almost always going to have the ability to dial in your latency so that you can kind of match your cameras, right? And oftentimes that's a completely manual process where you're like clicking your fingers or you're clapping a clapboard and you're making sure you're lining them up, because there really isn't any way to line the clocks up. But when you're in the live situation that we were talking about, now you also have AES-67 audio external. Those clock domains are not relatable. There's no math you can do to line that up. So if you get your cameras aligned, very oftentimes your iMag situations get a lot worse because you're kind of matching the highest amount of latency there. So if you've done systems like this is a very common challenge to kind of overcome. Not a dig against NDI by any stretch. They're doing a very hard thing. They've done it really, really well. It's just the trade-offs that they pick kind of highlight these kind of challenges that people have to overcome. So let's go to IPMX. So IPMX is I think it's a good way to look at it. It's like SMPTE 2110 DNA. Without the infrastructure tax is a little bit misleading. Sorry about that. I would more say that it's like a superset of SMPTE 2110. So, or it's like SMPTE 2110 with dials, right? So SMPTE 2110, you can make an IPMX system a completely compliant SMPTE 2110 system. So all your sources would flow right into SMPTE 2110 and AES-67 receivers and vice versa, if you wanted to, right? But the trick with IPMX, as mentioned earlier, is that it's added a lot more flexibility. So in our system here, let's assume a JPEG XS codec. Let's do 1080p 50. That gives us our subframe latency, but it brings the video down. As Jed and others have mentioned, PTP is not required. So if you're an implementer of IPMX, you must implement PTP support on your sender. You actually don't need to implement it at all on your receivers. There isn't actually a test in the IPMX certification program that actually tests for a receiver's PTP capability. It's just on the sender. But as a user, you can use it or not. And one thing I do want to mention, having PTP on your network, let's say you've got like HDMI cameras plugged in and PTP's on the network because you've got AES67 going there, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that the cameras are locked to PTP. The device is locked to PTP, but the camera can still free run. In IPMX, PTP and asynchronous behavior can happen at the same time. And we use RTCP sender reports to tell you the relationship between PTP time and your precise frame rate. So I just want to mention that little caveat there. So we can have PTP or not. Let's assume we don't bother with it. AES67 audio is native-ish, no bridge required. We can, of course, receive it in. Now, in our situation, actually, I'm going to back up. In our situation, we have AES67 on our network, right? So we're just going to use that. We already have PTP on the network. We'll plug it in. Our devices will accept it. They don't have to resync or anything, but now we have it, right? We're going to run our NMOS discovery in ad hoc mode, so we're not going to bother with the registry. We're just going to turn it on. And we're going to use the software switcher, right? Because our bandwidth is low, we totally can run this in software only. In fact, there's software implementations of IPMX today that in this environment, you would not need any kind of special hardware to make it work. Yeah, I think I covered everything on the slide here. Good job. Well, actually, I'm going to back here. So point being here, now we have, I should actually have another one here to mention the clock domain issue. But the point being here is that we have a system now. We're using PTP, but it's not something that's really beating us over the head. Had we not had AES67, we could have gone without it completely. But because AES67 is there, we're able to relate the clocks of the sources with the AES67 clock. We have, very low latency. We kept our system costs low. And we get that ease of use that we're trying for with NDI, but we have it with open standards and something that's more compatible with higher end production gear. One other thing I'll mention, though, is that I do want to kind of acknowledge that NDI does have an ease of use advantage in that typically NDI is run as a point-to-point thing, right? So like if I want to send content to multiple senders, I'm actually sending out multiple copies of that content to those multiple senders, whereas IPMX is multicast. So there is some additional configuration that you do have to do with IPMX speaking if you're using it in multicast mode. Technically, multicast or unicast is supported with IPMX, but you'll find that almost every device out there will do it in multicast. So where does that leave us? You can just go out there, get your NDI equipment and go with IPMX today. I would say I would love you to do that. My company would love you to do that. But I want to be very clear and honest with you about where IPMX is at today. So the first IPMX certification event happened in February. The birthday of IPMX, by the way, is January. Actually, it happened in January, and it's the birthday is January 23rd. So that's going to be on Trivial Pursuit at some point in your life. You'll now know it's 23rd of 2026. So right now, I would say this is a great time for early adopters and people that are already buying SMPTE 2110 equipment, but they can't have a choice, right? You can go ahead and get IPMX compatibility because, again, if you're a vendor and you make SMPTE 2110 gear, is really attractive to support IPMX because it's just but it's just a straightforward addition to the standard that you can put into your product. Keep your SMPTE 2110 performance, but now widen out the possibilities for your customers. So that's a really great way to go. ABC and HEVC support are profiles that are in certification right now. So those standards have been those specifications have been pretty much written. And there are people doing interoperability, dirty hands events right now with them. We expect that actual certification to happen at the end of this year and early next year. So our ecosystem is growing. I would say that early adopters, it's time for you guys to jump in. But, if you're making money with what you have now, maybe it's now time to plan. So how far can each system go? Just kind of a little bit of a review here. This is a bit of an eye chart as well. Obviously, the floor is very high, right? For SMPTE 2110, typically. You can do a camera system, but by show of hands, how many people have seen a SMPTE 2110 system like that, where it's a software switcher, 3 cameras? None? Yeah, I kind of thought so. You don't typically see that, right? NDI, that's very typical, right? Extremely typical. And with IPMX, that's where we want to see. That's what we're aiming at. We're aiming at that software implementation for that low-end system, very accessible, right? Maybe not quite as accessible as NDI is. We want to be honest about that, but getting very close, right? Ceiling, same ceiling as SMPTE 2110, right? I would say it's arguable that there's a few things about IPMX that are maybe a little bit beyond that. There aren't very many straight SMPTE 2110 systems that support RGB, whereas in uncompressed video, that's actually a requirement of IPMX. You have to support RGB because we're just expecting a ton of desktop content. So we make that a requirement of the standard. 1080p bandwidth, 1 to 300 for IPMX, 1 to 200 for NDI, and typically with SMPTE 2110, a 3 gigabit stream, although of course SMPTE 2110 supports JPEG XS. And of course, actually, as we bring in profiles to IPMX, those same profiles would work just as well with 2110. We're not doing anything really weird with -22 or anything. It works just like it does in 2110. The switching required is typically much more expensive on a SMPTE 2110 system. Even with PTP on IPMX, it's easier than it is with SMPTE 2110 because we back the defaults way off. So I think it's the delay requests or something. There's like a delay request. I can't remember the exact name of it, but that's a very high amount of traffic in SMPTE 2110 PTP. With IPMX, I think we backed that off by something like 16 times or something. So we're checking very much less often. The trade-off, of course, is just a little bit more buffering with IPMX, but a lot less infrastructure. Of course, with IPMX, you can turn that up to SMPTE 2110 levels, and it works great too. I'm going to maybe skip down this. I talked about PTP already. AES 67, Dante and AES 67 mode are just straight AES 67. Of course, that's part of IPMX and SMPTE 2110. There's a little bridging required in the clock mismatch in the NDI world. Mixed latency use cases, you can always align. You can do the math if you have PTP especially. You can reassociate your media clock with PTP and then realign those sources in a pretty straightforward manner with IPMX. IMAG, I bring that up because that's kind of the main reason why you might have a NDI system and you're like super happy with it until like your pastor says, hey, we're getting a video wall behind and I need you to have me on there. And then the audio and video are not in sync. So with IPMX, that's totally achievable. Wire encryption was mentioned earlier. This is really actually very exciting. Privacy encryption protocol was implemented in a way that's actually very similar to the way HDCP is implemented. So if you're an implementer, you can actually implement support for HDCP and PEP in a really straightforward way. They both use AES 128 AES 128, I think it is. Yeah. They both use AES 128. You can go to 256 if you want to. But the baseline is AES 128. And the way the encryption is done, you can actually use the same hardware to encrypt it twice if you're doing HTTP content over PEP, and you don't have to do double the implementation. Format control, IS-11. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. I think that's a really cool feature that's often overlooked. USB over IP, that's something that's part of IPMX, obviously not a huge deal for live production unless you're using IPMX to actually do KVM stuff in your production room, which is, not uncommon. So it's kind of nice to have the same technology used in all those places. Broadcast, anyway, I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but those are some of the details. So there is some extra stuff I wanted to mention. So one network with everything on it, right? So when we started talking about IPMX, actually when we brought SMPTE 2110 to Infocom, we didn't have very many people visiting our booth. I mean, there was not a lot of interest in bringing SMPTE 2110 into the Pro AV space. So as we went on and we, brought in the IPMX brand and we thought it through, we kind of distanced ourselves from SMPTE 2110, we were getting some traction, but I'll tell you, when the elbow hit the curve, when we really started to get a lot of interest, is when people made that connection between 2110 and what we were doing. So the idea for them of having a live production facility in their, like we were talking about earlier, those large corporations, schools, everywhere, they're doing live production. And then they've got a Crestron system, or they've got an AMX system. They've got some other proprietary form of AV over IP doing all the signal extension they do in the rest of the facility, all of it with its own discovery protocols, all of it with their own codecs, completely incompatible with their live production. And if you've got a large enterprise and you're dealing with multiple buildings, you're doing acquisitions, you have other things you're bringing in that aren't compatible with your main system, you're looking at all of these different islands of incompatibility and thinking, gosh, I wish I had just one way to do video on my network. And that's what they see in IPMX. So it became, really, really attractive to people that IPMX was close to SMPTE 2110. So that's when we flipped the script around and said, yes, SMPTE 2110 is awesome, and we're just like it. So that's, having that one standard for video on your network is a big deal. I mentioned PEP earlier. Already covered that. I do want to talk a little bit about format control and IS-11. This is something that I'm a little sensitive to, because I was a huge fan of IS-11, and we started talking to people that were doing live production. The first thing they would say is like, is there any way I can guarantee that that's turned off? So what IS-11 really was originally made for was, with SMPTE 2110, you have to tell the sender what to send. And if you know anything about the way like computers work, you plug your HDMI cable in, or you plug your DisplayPort cable in, and you plug your monitor in, it just works, right? And that's because you have something called EDID inside the monitor, which is called Extended Display ID, and it is sending its capabilities down the HDMI cable or the DisplayPort cable into your computer, and your computer says, oh, okay, that's your preferred resolution, or these are the things you can accept, or the left speakers on the second channel. And that is all kind of negotiated through that process. So what IS-11 is doing is it's really transposing that capability, not the file EDID, but the capability that EDID brings, and putting that into a multicast IP world, right? So you have multiple receivers. You get the capabilities from all those receivers. That includes the codecs, their profiles, all the stuff, all the extra stuff that you need to know. And then you can make a least common denominator. That's called a constraint set. That's sent to the sender, and that sender then can do whatever. So if it's a native sender, it'll just pick it and go. If it's not a native sender, if it's a gateway to like some baseband, it'll create an EDID, and then that's how you're going to get the format. The middle step in there is that you can actually define what your house resolution, what your house format is. So with a regular SMPTE 2110 system, you're 4 minutes into the show, you switch to camera 3 for the first time, and holy crap, it's not in the right frame rate. That's when you're going to find out about that. With IS-11, you would have had a loud error before you even attempted to do that. So having a nice loud error sometimes can be a super, super awesome thing. And IS-11 brings that kind of extra check. So practical path forward. So are you already running NGI? Start planning, evaluating SMPTE 2110. Maybe look for gear that supports IPMX as well. That might be, I think right now, that's kind of the most pragmatic way to go. And also you can check out the IPMX registry, which has all of the products that have been certified by AIMS, or by the group that is part of IPMX, which includes VSF, AMWA, AIMS, and EBU did our first testing event. So yeah, thank you very much. The takeaway here, IPMX brings SMPTE 21 standards, basically to the larger Pro AV world of live production. And I hope that through this talk, you see how IPMX brings the kind of the power of SMPTE 2110 to more people, allowing you to kind of take the parts that you need and scale up and out your system as you grow. So thanks a lot.